There's one more element to this bread thing I want to talk about. It's not just about Jesus' body or about accepting the sacrifice or the miraculous manna. Jesus frequently makes it obvious during his ministry that he is God. And with his simple mention of the bread, he is yet again claiming his divinity. Again, we got to go back to the Israelites. They have escaped slavery and are now in the wilderness. Very shortly after leaving Egypt, Moses goes to the top of Mount Sinai for 40 days, where God gives him the 10 Commandments on 2 stone tablets, as well as other instructions for how to worship God. Now remember, God's people have been slaves in Egypt for roughly 400 years. They had absorbed the religious customs of Egypt's polytheism. God wanted to reveal himself to his people and teach them how to worship only him. God first made a covenant, a promise, with Abraham. Then he makes a new covenant with the slaves, guided by Moses. Each time a covenant is made, there is a blood sacrifice. But there is also a revelation. This time, God tells Moses to build a portable tabernacle in the wilderness. There are extremely specific instructions on how to build it. The basic instructions involve the layout of the tabernacle. There are 3 rooms in the tabernacle. The third and smallest is the Holy of Holies, and in this room, God tells Moses to keep 3 things: the Ark of the Covenant, upon which God will sit, the golden lampstand, and the golden table of the bread of the presence. On this table were kept wine offerings and bread. The Hebrew expression for this bread is, I'll try my best, lehem hapanim. The Hebrew word panim means face. God made his covenant with Moses and the people. They feasted, and then God told Moses to build a dwelling place where he would keep an earthly representation of God's heavenly face. In Leviticus, we learn God's instructions were for the priests to bake 12 breads every Sabbath to represent the 12 tribes. They would place this on the golden table along with frankincense and offer the bread as a sacrifice, and then the priests would eat the bread. We know it was a sacrifice because there was incense included, which signified sending the offering to heaven. The prophet Ezekiel refers to this table as an altar, and it occurred on the Sabbath, which was a day only for rest and sacrifice. Now bring this back to the time of Jesus. By this point, the Israelites had been in the Promised Land for many years, and it was common for the men to go to Jerusalem and the temple 3 times a year for Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. At these times, the priests of the temple would remove the golden table from within the holy place and show it to these Jewish men. The command to go to Jerusalem for these feasts was actually a command to see the face of the Lord. But we know that no man can see God's face and live, so what can this mean? Well, by showing these men the bread, the priests were fulfilling this part of the law. Now, even more interesting though, is that as the priests held up the showbread, they would shout, "Behold, God's love for you." Strange that they would show these men bread and call it God's love, but remember that the Bible describes God's covenant with Israel as a marriage bond. This bread was the sign of God's everlasting covenant, thus it was a sign of God's love for his people. So then, did Jesus ever refer to himself as God's love? Well, in Matthew, we see an interesting story. We look at it and see that Jesus is getting berated for working on the Sabbath, but dig deeper and we'll see there's more to it. Jesus and the disciples were plucking grain on the Sabbath because they were hungry. This was prohibited by the Pharisees. And when questioned, Jesus replies, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence?" Here Jesus compares himself to King David, who was also a priest. David was allowed to enter and eat the bread. And since he could administer the bread, he could also give it to the men who were with him. The next part, Jesus says, "Or have you not read how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless?" He was comparing himself to the priests in the temple. They would work on the Sabbath by making the bread. And last, Jesus says, "I tell you, something greater than the temple is here." Now, it's this last statement is the biggest of them all. The temple is the most high holy place. It is where God lived. What could be greater than that? Jesus says, here he is greater than the temple. And what is greater than the temple? Only God. So when Jesus used bread at the Last Supper and gave it to his disciples, saying it was his body, Jesus was also showing them the bread and saying, Behold my love for you.